Hi, this is Kylie Koo. Welcome to my studio. Our challenge this week for the Mixed Media Emporium Facebook group is resist techniques. I'm going to try a few today and some worked out better than others. But I am using these pieces of watercolour. Now this came from a Daler-Rowney Aquafine smooth pad, 300 GSM, £140. I cut this into a number of ATC sized cards, 3.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and I simply rounded the corners just because that's the way I like them. A little small corner rounder. So let's get started. I'll leave a note of all the products I've used today below, but I'm starting with this clear embossing ink pad and this stamp. This is one of my favourites. I got this in Hobbycraft, I know that, in quite some time ago. So I've laid out two of my cards together because I'm going to use the same stamp on both. I just want a part of the stamp to be on it. Just giving my pad a bit of a wipe there because it was a bit kind of grungy from the last time that I used it, and I'm making sure that I get good coverage on my stamp. Obviously the fact that it's clear, can't really see it, so I'm not taking any chances. I'm making sure that I ink it up well. I'm going to stand up to do this and press down firmly, so I should get roughly half the stamp design on each card. And although it's a clear ink, you can actually see the stamped effect there. And I dry this well with my heat tool. So I've put an old book page under the sheets there just to keep my pad clean, and I'm just going to use some watercolour paints here. Okay, and just using a watercolour brush. So just going to take a couple of colours. I think it's a kind of green and a blue that I use. Obviously if you wanted to try this technique, you just use whatever you have, and I'm just dropping some water onto my paints just to get them activated. I used to spray them, but it seems such a waste to spray across all the paints when in fact I'm only going to use a couple. So here we go. Just taking that blue over, and in a moment I'll take some of the green, and you can see here that the embossing ink has pretty much resisted the paint. It takes on a bit of the colour, but you can still see the print there. But I'm going to leave that to dry on its own. So next I'm going to try these Twinkling H2os. I want to try a number of different supplies, different products today, because I know that all of you have different things. So that one's Raspberry Wine, Harvest Soul and Golden Nugget. So it's a while since I had these out. The lids are always very difficult to get off, I find, after I've used them. I don't know if I properly dry them or what from time, in between times, but yeah, always difficult. So again, just dropping some water into the three that I'm going to use, and the exact same process here. Just going over that, and again you can see that there is a bit of resist from that clear embossing ink. Harvest Soul, to me, it's a kind of gold colour, but it never seems very pigmented, so I'm just kind of mixing my colours in there. I mean, again, for me this week, this is very much about experimenting. And again, in a moment, I'll put this off to the side to dry. Next, I'm going to use my small gel plate. You don't need a gel plate, you could just use the acrylic block or a piece of plastic just to spread paint out on. I've got a stencil here. This is by Snip Art, which I got through Craftbox UK. I don't know the name of it though. And what I'm going to use here is petroleum jelly, Vaseline. Now you'll see in a moment, this is a very old tub. It's been sitting in my garage, used by December, what was that, 2002. So yeah, it's kind of old, so I wasn't sure what this would be like. Just putting my palette knife in there, and I'm just going to spread this through part of the stencil. I'm not going to do the entirety of the card, just that kind of right hand side. I think it was Bridget Coopson that I first saw do this technique, so if I can find a link to her video I'll put it below, but you can see it there. Now I want to do a second one, the exact same process, just doing it on a slightly different place on the other card. So now I'm taking my gel plate and I'm going to take two colours, just craft paints, a bronze and I think it's a magenta, and I'm just going to put these down onto my gel plate. As I say, you could use anything at all here, it's just something to spread the colour out. Because what I'll do in a moment is I will put one of the cards down onto this. Now of course the petroleum jelly is very soft, so you can't press down on it too hard, but basically I'm trying to get the paint over the entirety of the card, including in between where the stencil, the kind of negative bits of the stencil. So you see there it's not covered it fully, so I'm going to put it back down on the plate and I will press gently again, and I need to do this a couple of times. So trying to be very gentle, trying to get the paint where I want it, but at the same time trying not to squish the petroleum jelly down. And I just keep going until I get as much coverage as possible. I then just use up that excess paint on some old dictionary pages. So taking my Glimmer Mist and Patina, and that's Cosmic Shimmer Spray in Blue Ice. And I'm just going to give that a spray. Now with the petroleum jelly you can't use a heat tool to dry it, so again I'm just going to put these off to the side and hope that they dry pretty quickly. You'll see I just let the ink move about, trying again to get it in between all the raised edges of the petroleum jelly. So I'll just leave that to dry. Can't use the heat tool this time, but drying up what was on there. Now I'm taking an oil pastel, and this is a Reeves make just in white. You could use any type of oil pastel. I thought this might work in the way that a candle would work. This, I'm afraid, was kind of one of the fails. Either a normal white crayon would be better, you know, just a kid's crayon, or a candle. I decided with this one I would use my sprays again, and you can kind of see the lines there a little bit, but I don't know, it's quite warm in my studio today, so I don't know if it just got a little bit too soft, the crayon, or if it kind of dissolved with the spray, because these are, at the end of the day, water soluble to an extent. Now I decided to also try Faber-Castell Gelatos. These are a bit crayon-like but softer, and they are also water soluble, but I thought this would just be a good way to experiment to see how these would do. I just used two colours, peach and a grey. Not quite sure why I decided to put two colours on it as the bottom layer, but I did anyway, and for me it was quite interesting how this actually turned out. A bit of a fail, but not too bad a fail. So I'm taking some Dr. P.H. Martin's ink. The colours are Tangerine and Golden Yellow, and I'm just dropping some of both onto there. Now again, perhaps because it was particularly warm in my studio today, when I started to do this, it actually started to move the peach gelato, but not the grey, which kind of surprised me, but there we go. As I say, it was very much about experimenting, so letting some of the excess ink just drop off there. Now what I decided to do here was to dry it a bit and then to take a baby wipe to see if I could get any of the gelato off underneath. but I think drying it actually melted some of the gelato a bit more. So I didn't let it fully dry, and you'll see there that I am trying to take some of it off. It worked a little bit, but not in the way I was kind of hoping for. But it's okay, it's all about experimenting, it's all trial and error, and unless you try these things you just never know. In the end I actually quite like this card. It's got a bit of a distressed look to it, so you know, it won't be wasted. Checking my other cards, you can see a bit of the wax pastel there, not a lot, and you can see here that this paint's starting to dry. The petroleum jelly is of course still wet, but it's not fully dry yet, so I put them back off to the side. So I'm now going to use some gouache, and again I have to say this was a big fail. Now, I had seen someone else do this. Again, I'm sorry I can't remember the person's name, but if I can find the video then I will certainly link it below. I use 3 colours of gouache, an ochre, a red and a white, and all I'm going to do is to paint a very quick design onto one of my ATCs. So just a tree, thinking here about spring and blossom, and that's kind of reflected in the tree here. So I'm taking the Bombay ink in Aqua, and what you need here, or at least my understanding of the technique, is you need to take an ink that is not water soluble, so you want a permanent ink. So these are permanent, and I go over this and it looks pretty drastic just now. So I'm just painting that over, trying to make single sweeps across it. Now I think this is where I may have gone wrong, in as much as I dried it with the heat tool rather than letting it dry normally. But what you're supposed to do at this stage is run it under the tap, run it under water. I couldn't take my camera to the sink, so I thought I would just try it with a baby wipe. Now the thing here is that I rubbed too hard, and you'll see right away that I'm starting to rub off the paper rather than actually rubbing off the ink. The idea is that the gouache, which is opaque, will actually sit underneath and the ink comes off it. Now it does give a bit of a distressed look, which is why I quite like this. Taking a kind of hard bristled brush there, trying to work the water in there, and again I'll go back to it with the baby wipe, trying to take a bit more off. So you can see some of the paint starting to peek through, but I'm actually taking off more paper than anything else here. And it's funny, although it ends up a bit of a disaster, again there's something about it that I quite like. I like the distressed look. Now I think at that point I took it off to the sink, ran it under the tap, and it softened the ink a little bit more, just taking that plastic palette knife and really just scraping it off, so you can see the little bits of pink coming out there. But yeah, it was a fail, there's no doubt about that, but I did decide to try it again. I still had some of the gouache left, so I quickly painted another tree. I put it off to the side to dry and just started to look at the other cards, giving the wax crayon one a bit of a wipe, wasn't doing much. Looking again at my other two, and I'm taking the baby wipe and wiping off the petroleum jelly, the Vaseline. And this has come up really nicely, I think. It was lifting little bits of paint, but I don't think that's surprising, because of course any paint that sat on top of the Vaseline probably wasn't going to dry there and then anyway. And here's the one with the ink, and I could still see little bits of that were wet, so I just took my plastic palette knife and literally just scraped the petroleum jelly off. And again, I think this has turned out really nicely. This was probably one of the best techniques. So back to my very quickly painted tree, And this time I'm taking a different ink. So this time I took Winsor & Newton black drawing ink, Indian ink, and I'm just going to do the exact same process as before. This doesn't have a dropper, so I just put some into my little jar there, and I'm putting on a fairly thick coat. Now again, I dried this using my heat tool, and I think that may be the wrong thing to do. I took it to the tap, ran it under the tap, and just letting you see here. Now, it may have been that the gouache wasn't fully dry underneath, because you'll see there that some of that's spreading. So, here's my final result. The top layer were kind of the fails, the bottom layer, for me, were better. So that was the wax pastel. You can kind of see some of the lines, but very faint. The gelatos, a bit of a fail, but I quite like what was left, and the two that I did with the gouache really didn't turn out very well at all. Now, if you're in the Mixed Media Emporium, we are saying use any resist techniques that you want this week. You don't have to do any that Nina and myself are doing. And of course, I'll leave a link to Nina's below. If you're putting anything onto social media, then please do use the hashtag the Mixed Media Emporium. And of course, you can tag Nina and I if you want to. This was the ones with the embossing ink, and I think they've turned out really quite nicely, and the two with the petroleum jelly look good. I was really pleased with the way they turned out. So I didn't want to take anything out just because it was a fail, because I think it's important to show you that experimenting doesn't always work, but it's still fun to try. I'm going to try that one with the gouache and the ink at some time again in the future. But thanks for watching. Hope to see you again next time. Take care. Bye for now.